Hi guys, it's Nicole. Welcome back to another video. Today is going to be a long one and a video I have also sort of been putting off for some time. It's my December wrap up and I've been putting it off because December was the most successful reading month I had in 2021 and I read over 20 books, so we have over 20 books to talk about today. I will have timestamps in the description box, so if there are only some books you're interested in hearing about, you can just skip to those bits where I review that book. Let's get into it. Grab a cup of tea, grab some food, because this is going to be a long one. I do want to just start off by saying that a lot of these books are actually going to be in a vlog I have not completed yet. Basically, I did a reading vlog where I read every single book that was nominated in the Goodreads Choice Awards in the fantasy category. My plan originally was to get that up by the end of 2021. That obviously did not happen. Work got in the way, time got in the way. Well, time got away really. I still plan to finish that vlog, but most of the books that are going to be read for that vlog have been read and they were read in December, so a lot of these books you will have more in-depth thoughts of mine as I was reading the books, but that will be released in that vlog when that comes out, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. I still have a couple of books I want to finish off for that vlog and I think the editing is going to take me a little while, but I did just want to start off by saying that, so you're gonna notice a trend. There's a lot of fantasy here. There's quite a few books I did not enjoy, unfortunately. Let's just dive in. That is enough of a intro, I think. First book I want to talk about is Under the Whispering Door by TJ Klune. I did not like this book. I really did not like this book, and oh, I kind of feel bad for saying so. This story follows a man who dies. Within the first chapter of the book, he dies, and he was an awful man when he was alive. Like, he was just mean, he didn't care for others, he just basically didn't have a good bone in his body. He dies, he's a ghost. We follow him as a ghost, basically reflecting on his life, how he mistreated so many people, and just what he was doing wrong. I just hated this story. I feel like it's very rare that like a story, like the entire story itself, does not work for me. Like, usually there's a component or, you know, just something that I don't like, but there are other bits I might have enjoyed or, you know, could see value in. But this, I just flat out just like, no, I did not like the characters, like particularly the main character. Like, he was really the only one I like disliked. The other characters I just didn't think served anything to the story other than helping the main character figure out how much of an asshole he was. It was just an unpleasant read. I just didn't agree with the message of the book. I feel so harsh saying that. The thing is, this entire book is a redemption story for this character, and I was never on board the redemption at any point in the story. Like, I never thought that this dude deserved a redemption. I never understood why he was mean. I never felt like the time he had to reflect and understand how wrong he was towards others was like justified. Oh, I don't know. I just did not vibe with this book at all. I think as well, like, the humor in it was not my kind of humor. I really struggle to have like anything good to say. Talking about it now, I feel like I really should have given it 1 star instead of the 2-star rating I gave it, but I just didn't, because I think like it's just not for me. I don't know. I'm gonna leave it at 2 stars. I don't want to overthink it. Let's switch between a book I disliked and a book I liked for this video. I think that would be a nicer way to go about filming. So the next book I really want to talk about because I really enjoyed, and that is For the Wolf. This is a Little Red Riding Hood retelling. I would say it's a very loose Little Red Riding Hood retelling, other than the main character being called Red and us having a character called the Wolf and a character that I would say is kind of similar to the Huntsman, but kinda, like, you know, emphasis on the kinda. Other than that, this really isn't a Little Red Riding Hood retelling. It's very much its own story, its own fantasy book. We follow in here, like I said, Red, who is short for Adaris, and she is a princess, and in her line, her family line, the second born princess has always been sacrificed to the wilder wood and then taken away by the wolf. She's a twin and she is the youngest of the twins, so she's technically the second born daughter, and she's been raised her whole life knowing that she is going to be sacrificed. She doesn't really know what is going to come of that sacrifice. She just knows that it's important that it happens because there's this belief within her kingdom that when the daughters are sacrificed, then there's the possibility of these lost gods returning, and it also like keeps peace and like, you know, evil away. I loved the sort of religious cult court setting we had at the beginning, and then we follow her once she's out of that setting and once she's been sacrificed, and she learns what really happens to those daughters and the magic of the world and the wolf and how she and him and everything is entangled in it all. I loved that. The setting was the best part. I love settings. I think something I'm really learning about myself is settings is such an important element to stories for me. If I love the setting, I tend to like really love the book. The writing was gorgeous. It's very atmospheric. The perfect sort of wintertime book. I would recommend to read this. Like, I read it during summer. I just wish it was winter because of how just beautiful the writing was. Like, I just wanted it to take me there. I did also enjoy the relationship that Red and like the wolf end up developing. I've said this a couple of times on my channel and it's so questionable every time I say it, but I definitely have a thing for romances being developed when the two characters are in a hostage sort of situation. The perfect example, and where I think this love of this trope comes from for me, is like Peter and Katniss from the Hunger Games. So obviously, like, while they're in the Hunger Games, they do their fake marriage, well, not marriage, relationship, sorry, and then they are also in that sort of Hunger Games setting, which is sort of like a hostage situation. I think that's where my love for this trope comes from, and there's a similar scenario in here, like obviously quite different. This is a very different book to the Hunger Games, but that trope is sort of in here in its own way, and I love that trope. So I think this book also had a special spot in my heart for that reason as well. I'm excited to see where the sequel takes us because this is only a duology, I believe, so the sequel is also going to be a conclusion and hopefully comes out in 2022 sometime. The next two books I'm going to discuss together because they are book 1 and book 2 in a series, and that is A Deadly Education and The Last Graduate, both by Naomi Novik. I listened to the audiobook of both of these and I gave both of them 1 star. Yeah, I did not like these books at all. I have quickly learned with Naomi Novik. I've only read this series of hers and I've read a few of the books in the Temeraire series. I love her ideas. Her ideas are really, really intriguing, but the way she executes her ideas, boring. This book essentially follows a bunch of magical students who attend a school known as the Scholomance, and there are all these monsters in this world. There's all these monsters in the school that are out to kill and basically take the magical essence from these students. So they're at this school trying to learn how to protect themselves, also trying to become more powerful, and there's this huge event known as like their graduation that they're leading up to. I did not like the world building in this. I was quite confused. Even now I'm still quite confused because these magical kids, it was said that they were basically going to die if they were out in the real world without attending a magical school, because they would never learn how to protect themselves. But then while they were at the school, there was all these monsters in the school as well that were out to get them, and a lot of them die anyway, and it just like contradicted itself. Like, I feel like the purpose of things happening in the story, like the purpose of the kids being at the school and not in the outside world, was contradicted and pointless because they could still die. Like, the dying risk was still so high. I think it was supposed to create these really intense stakes for the setting and like the danger that these kids were in, but I was too busy the entire time trying to make sense of why the author chose to have the setting like this and do things this way that nothing ever felt thrilling. Anything really. I did not like the main character either. I found her quite insufferable. She was just very standoffish, written in a way where she wasn't just insufferable and off-putting to those characters in the book, but also to you, the reader. I found it really difficult to get to know her. I didn't understand her motivations or goals. I just couldn't root for her because of that. One of the biggest reasons why I disliked this book so much was the narration. The particular way the story was narrated was awful. It would at certain points stop and talk to you, the reader. It did that breaking the third wall thing. I know that's what it's called in like media, like movies and such, but I don't know if that's what it's called in books, but that's what it did here. It also happened at very unnecessary points. It would happen after the author had done a huge explanation on some sort of world building or magic or something, and then all of a sudden the main character would be talking to you directly, the reader. It was very jarring. I unfortunately don't have a good thing to say about these books, and I did pick them up for my Goodreads reading vlog, so you will hear a lot about them, a lot of ranting about them in that video. It sucks that Naomi, Novik and I just don't seem to be clicking with her books, because she's an author, a fantasy author I heard so many amazing things about and I was so intrigued about, but not really anymore. I do still have her Spinning Silver and Uprooted on my shelves, so I may give them a go, but then after that I don't see myself really reading more of her books. The next two books I want to talk about are also part of a series. The first book is The Golem and the Jinni, and the sequel, The Hidden Palace. I enjoyed these. Like, overall I enjoyed both of these books. They are historical fantasy, and in book one we follow a golem. If you don't know what a golem is, it's basically a person made out of clay, and they're usually made with a master and the intention of the master, so they have someone that they're supposed to follow. And our golem in this story is made, and she's on a ship to New York in the early 1900s with her master, but as they were traveling and just before they arrived to New York, her master dies, and she's only just been awoken while she's on the ship. So she suddenly finds herself in New York with no master, no purpose, trying to find her way to live. It is dangerous. Like, she can't really tell anyone who and what she is because she has like extra strength and people can be fearful of her. And then the second character we follow is the Jinni, who also finds himself in New York once an old man opens up a old oil bottle and he's been locked inside there for hundreds and hundreds of years. Essentially, this story doesn't have a whole lot of plot. It's very much a character focused story on these two characters, and it's about them, both of them being magical beings who are trying to live human lives, or in disguise amongst humans, and hide away their non-humanness. Essentially, I really like this. I found it a really delightful read and very endearing to follow these characters, and I think they contrasted each other quite nicely. One was a lot more hot-headed, one was a lot more like timid and fearful. Then we also see like their friendship form. I definitely preferred book one though over book two. Personally, don't think book two was necessary. While I did enjoy it, I found that there were certain things that were kind of hinted at in book one, but I was really happy never happened. For instance, I didn't want a romance between these two characters to develop, and there was a little bit of a romance that did develop in the second book. But I really liked in the first book that it was just like this friendship between these two. I found that just so much more worthy, and like I just invested myself so much more in that sort of relationship than a romance between these two. And I think also the sequel just went off and basically just did the same thing. These books are one of those books where there's no huge plot or action. It's just very much about like the mundane things of life and like ordinary life and just like living day-to-day life, which I find quite peaceful and relaxing to read about sometimes. But I do think sometimes it can get to a point where it's boring, and I do think in the second book that sort of did happen, especially since we'd had it all happen in book one, but that was like perfect. That was the perfect amount to make it a pleasant story, whereas it just overdid it a little bit in the sequel. I did love the writing. I love the setting. A lot of it was set in like winter time in New York in the early 1900s, and again, I love settings, and it was a really nice setting to follow with really like pleasant characters, and I'm really glad I read this. Actually, I've been meaning to kind of give The Golem and the Genie a go for a long time. Like, it's been on my radar, but it's also a book that's fallen off my radar a lot, that I could see myself like not having read it just because I forgot about it. But I did pick it up for the Goodreads vlog, and I'm so glad I did. I gave the first book, The Golem and the Genie, 4 stars, and I gave the sequel, The Hidden Palace, 3 stars. Let's talk about another series I completed the last 2 books of in December, and that is, whoops, I just dropped a few things. City of Dragons, which is book 3 in the Rainwild series, quartet, I'm not too sure, and Blood of Dragons, both by Hobb. I talked about this series quite a bit in my last couple of wrap-ups because I read book 1 in October and book 2 in November, and I was determined in December to finish off this series, and I'm so glad I did. I definitely think that the books got better as they went. I just think Hobb has a real talent for making you just get so invested in characters, and that's definitely what happened by these books. I was hooked on these characters. I was obsessed with them. I loved the dragons. Like, we have like human characters, but we have all these dragon characters who really form their own personalities, and it's just so much fun to watch them all and to see them grow, and the dynamics between each of the dragons, and also the dynamics between the dragons and the humans. I also did like to see how in this last book how it connected to the greater world of the Realm of the Elderlings and the other series, and I'm very interested to see how it ends up affecting the next series. I don't have a whole lot to say than I've already said about these books in my previous wrap-ups, so if you want to hear my thoughts, I will leave the wrap-ups linked down below. Both of them I gave 3 stars, even though I don't rate these highly. I had a very comforting and enjoyable time reading these, and I can't really say a whole lot, which is why I'm keeping this short because of how far in a series these books are. I don't want to spoil you. So the next book to discuss is The Crown of Gilded Bones, which is the 3rd book in the From Blood and Ash trilogy. This isn't the final book. I actually went into this thinking it was the final book in the trilogy. It is not. It's only book 3 out of 6. I do not understand how she could milk this series to make 6 books. But she's doing it. She's doing it. I definitely think that these books are very long-winded. There's a lot of repetition, like just conversation. Like, so much of this book is made up of dialogue between these characters, which is very unnecessary. Not only is there one conversation happening with the characters, but those same conversations are being repeated to other characters, and it's just like, we've been through this. I will say, I listened to the audiobook of every single book in this trilogy. I gave this last book 2 stars. I think I also gave the second one 2 stars, and the first one I gave 3 stars. I personally think the first book is the best, and then it just gets too long-winded, too convoluted as well by this last book. But there is something about these books that is so easy to listen to that I don't mind consuming, because you just kind of have them on. You don't have to have half your brain on. You can have them on while you're, you know, doing other things. That is sort of enjoyable, and I think that's why I didn't mind this book, and I don't have so much hatred for it or like despise it like I did with, you know, A Deadly Education. I think I just went into that with more expectations as well, whereas with this book I went into it thinking, or with the expectations that it was going to be exactly what it was going to be, that I didn't mind. I don't love the characters in this either. I find them just very cringy. Like, it's very cringe, this book, but it is fun. I will say it is kind of a little bit ridiculous and fun. It was a ride I'm not gonna lie, I'm not mad I got on. Okay, so the next book I want to quickly talk about is a Splintered by Alix E. Harrow. This is a really short novella and it's a Sleeping Beauty retelling. We basically follow a girl who's from our world and one day she gets transported into this parallel world where she finds like Sleeping Beauty. I didn't really like this that much. I thought it was like fun and I can definitely see a lot of people enjoying it. For me, what didn't work was the tone of the story. It was very quirky. It just wasn't my vibe. Also, I don't think I really liked the main character as much, but I did enjoy Sleeping Beauty's character and it did have some like fun twists and it was short to get through, so that was kind of nice to have like just a story you could listen to in one night. I think I might have been expecting maybe a little bit too much. That is because of how many amazing things I've heard of this author, but maybe it's not fair of me to place those expectations on this book since what I have recently heard that is so well loved of her books is from her actual novels, not her novella. So I may give another one of her books a go. I have yet to decide it though. The next book I want to talk about is a book I read in my Christmas Songs Choose my TBR vlog, and that is The Beast Warrior. This is the sequel to The Beast Player. The Beast Player was one of my favorite books of 2021. It made it to my favorites list and I did really enjoy the sequel, just not quite as much, but enough that I still gave it 4 stars and would recommend. This book takes place 10 years after the events of the first book, and essentially in our first book we are following this character who ends up finding herself training one of the royal beasts. The royal beasts are creatures I kind of vision quite similar to dragons, but like not quite. This series deals a lot with how humans use animals, particularly dangerous animals, in war or for their own benefit, and we follow a character who is just really sweet and never has like ill intentions to use the beast for her own gain or anything like that, but to form a bond with them. And I loved that about this series, was the bonds between these humans and these creatures. This is a book where I don't think it was entirely necessary. Again, like I said with the Hidden Palace, we had a lot of the same things just sort of occurring, quite similar to the Golem, the Jinni, and the Hidden Palace as well. This is very much a series that follows the day-to-day lives in this like fantasy setting, which I really enjoyed, but I didn't mind it in the sequel. I just loved the characters and the story and the setting so much that to be here again and to be here again in a later time with the characters older and the politics having sort of simmered into something different was really interesting and enjoyable to follow. I think that the first book does stand really well on its own though, so if you've read it and you feel like you've had enough of the story or gotten what you wanted out of it, then you could definitely finish there and you don't have to continue. This definitely isn't necessary. In fact, the author did write in her author's note that she wasn't originally planning on writing a sequel and then eventually she did. But I loved the writing. I do think this is a good translation, just my judgment. It's not very expert judgment at all, of course, but I did really like it and I think it's a beautiful story that like one you just want to cuddle up to with a tea on the couch because it's so magical and fairy tale-esque. I also listened to the audiobook of The Girl in Kellers Way, which is a thriller by Megan Golden, who is an author I started reading last year in 2021 and really came to enjoy what I read of hers. The first book I read of hers was The Night Swim, and then I also read The Escape Room, so I had decent expectations I guess when I went into The Girls at Kellers Way, which unfortunately were not met. This is her debut book and I definitely think that was evident. There was a lot of things I just sort of took issue with and didn't like, and I don't like to see in my thrillers. One thing I don't ever see myself getting on board with in thrillers is when we have a female character's mental well-being being questioned or like mental state being questioned and then she's not believed because she's believed to be crazy. We had that a bit in here. That just irks me. Like I just feel like I can't look at any other parts of the story and enjoy any other parts of the story or say anything good about them because like that one thing is in here and it just overshadows everything. and just ruins the rest of the book for me. We switch in this book between two POVs. We're following a policewoman who's trying to figure out a murder case of a girl who died in Kellers Way, and then we are also following another woman who is married to a professor and just sort of like their life. I don't want to go too much into this because it is a thriller, and I always like to keep synopses of thrillers short and my thoughts short, but also because it's been a little while since I read this, and I read it quite quickly on audio, that I don't want to give anything away. But I did not like this. I think it's interesting because it had pretty much the same setup as other Megan Golden books. She does do the two sort of POVs, and they're usually switching between past and present, and one timeline in the present you're trying to figure out a missing piece of the past, but also how the mystery of the past connects to the present. And that same thing happened, or that same formula of story occurred in this book, but it was so much better executed in her later books. So it's good to see that she has improved as an author, and I definitely do plan to pick up her newer stuff. But if you have picked up her latest stuff and you're thinking about going and reading her backlist, I would recommend giving this one a skip. I just was not a fan. I gave it 1 star. The next book I want to talk about is a new favourite. I think it was my favourite read of the month, or definitely one of my favourite reads in December, and that is The Silent Parade by Keigo Higashino. This is his latest book that's been translated into English, and I loved it. It is part of his Detective Galileo series, and I think this may be my favourite one yet. This series is a thriller detective mystery series. It's very mystery, and I love that, and I love how the mystery is done. This one was really interesting because there was more than one case involved in the story, and all the cases end up sort of being linked, and there was different like POVs. There was a lot going on, and I think it was so well done and so intriguing, and the twist so good. The main, or maybe just the first case in this that we follow in this book, there's this young girl who was training to be a singer who goes missing, and 3 years ago her body was found, and then there are some other murders that also occurred, and then everything sort of ends up being linked. I love the mysteries of these books, and I love how focused they are on the victim and the suspects and those people around the victim. I think you really get to know those characters, and their backstory and the intention behind things is so well thought out that you can't help but get invested. And that's what I love about the series. I'm so happy that this came out, because I didn't think, after reading the Midsummer's Equation, which is the last book in this series I'd read before this one, that there was going to be any more. I thought that was going to be it. So it gives me hope. It gives me so much hope that maybe we'll have more books in this series being published, because it needs to happen. It needs to happen, please. Let's discuss one of the most disappointing books of last year. That is The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri. I love Empire of Sand so much. I've talked about it a lot. I've been thinking a lot about it recently, and how I should probably reread it, since it's officially been a year since I've read it, which is mind-blowing. But this was so disappointing. I think there were really cool ideas in here. We follow a princess who has been exiled and is basically being imprisoned in this temple because of her brother. She ends up forming a alliance and friendship and romance with a maid who sort of serves at the temple, and we follow them. I think the biggest thing about this was I was expecting so much more from the relationship, like especially how it developed, because it just happened and there was no development to it happening. And something that Empire of Sand did so well was how the relationship developed. It was slow burn. You saw these characters sort of meet their hesitancy with one another, then you saw them make an alliance, and then you saw them have a friendship and then a romantic relationship. I was hoping with this book we would get something similar, because that was what Tasha Suri did really well. Even in Realm of Ash, which is book 2 to Empire of Sand, I still think the relationship was well done in that. Not as good as the first one, but still done well. And I had really high hopes to see that in here, but it just wasn't existence. I think a huge issue with this book was there were too many POVs. We started off and we had the two POVs of the maid and the princess. I was like, okay, that's fine. We just got these two POVs. But as the book went on and on, there were more and more POVs being added. I don't understand why. It made it very convoluted and messy and difficult to follow. I think that it also made it really hard to get a grasp of characters and the story in general. I just don't think that multiple POV, particularly the way Tasha Suri writes multiple POVs, is something for her, maybe. I know she was trying to show like all these different groups, and there's a lot of politics happening in this world, and there's like a rebel group, there's stuff happening with like the religion and the magic, and there's like cursed rot wood that people get. They get this like cursed rot wood where basically they start turning into like a plant and end up dying, and that was like interesting but so all over the place that I couldn't make sense of it. And there was so much of this book I just could not make sense of, and I'm really disappointed. I did give it 3 stars. It's probably more of a 2 if we're being honest. Let's quickly talk about a book I did discuss quite a bit in the vlog it was in, and that is Song of Blood and Stone. This book was originally a self-published book, I found out, and then this version I have is the traditionally published version. I did not like the writing, the story, the characters. No. What is it about? So we follow this girl who at the beginning she is struggling because her family left her in all this debt. There are debt collectors trying to get her farm off her basically so that her debt can be paid back. She ends up running into this spy, ends up running away with the spy to like this other part of the kingdom. I don't even know, like this story just has so many random things happening. It was kind of difficult to make sense of. Not difficult like A Deadly Education, I will say that. I could make more sense of this book than I could of A Deadly Education. That was just because the world building in that book was another level. In here, it just felt very random. There were all these random bits and pieces being thrown together and just tossed on the page. And it just didn't lead anywhere. I didn't like the characters. I think they were very two-dimensional. Actually, everything about this book was very two-dimensional. There's this whole thing about this main character having like magical abilities, and her magical abilities being like feared, and that was what makes her outcasted. It was just a lot, and nothing was developed. That was the other thing. We had all these random things being thrown at us, but nothing was ever developed or went anywhere or was explored. We just kind of moved on to the next thing. I gave this 1 star. I will not be continuing on with this series. I believe the books in this series are companion series anyway, so we don't follow these characters, but I just really was not a fan of the writing or storytelling or the world that I have no desire to continue, so I won't be. The next book I want to talk about is The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne. I really enjoyed this. John Gwynne is an author I have enjoyed. I do think his storytelling and his writing and even his characters is quite simplistic, but he does it in a way that's fun. I think he always has a lot of action and a lot of things happening that is quite fun, and he writes like sort of endearing characters in a really gruesome fantasy setting, which is a combination I enjoy. This is a multiple POV fantasy story, and it is in this world where there are all these different creatures. There are trolls, there are dragons, there are giant wolves. It's just very, very dangerous, and we follow these characters in this sort of Viking setting. The main characters we follow is this family, and the son of the family gets taken away, and then we're following the mother. So we have this like MILF character trying to like hunt down her stolen missing son, and she's cool, she's badass. And then another story we have is a former slave trying to get revenge for his sister. So we kind of have all these different characters that have similar motives, like they're trying to avenge family members or be reunited with family members. I don't have a whole lot to say about it. I did enjoy the mythology sort of Viking Norse setting, but it is quite simplistic, and I can see some people not enjoying that, because there were times things were happening for the convenience of the plot or like too easily, but I think it was just fun. I gave it 3.5 stars in the end, and I do plan to continue whenever the sequel comes out. The last book I read in my Christmas reading vlog was The Disappearances. This is a contemporary fabulism, magical realism type of story. Well, actually, it's not really contemporary. It's got a contemporary sort of setting, but it's actually set in the 1940s during the war, but it doesn't really have anything to do with the war. I went into this thinking it's a contemporary, and it felt like a contemporary the entire time while reading it, but I guess technically it isn't. We follow a girl and her younger brother who have to go and move in with some family friends that they don't really know, like family friends of her mother's, because her mother dies and their father has to go off to war, so they have no other family to really take them in. So they find themselves being taken in by her mother's friends, and they are also taken to the town of Sterling, which is where their mother grew up. And in this town, things disappear. So things like people's reflections or like the smell of things has disappeared. So those like little ordinary everyday things. It's a story about our main character learning about her mother, about the disappearances in this town and her mother's connections to them. I like the concept of the story. It was very intriguing, very interesting. The story itself was very quick and easy to get through. I read it within a matter of days and I did overall like it. It did leave a memorable impression on me, but I don't think the characters or the setting was my favorite or that impressionable that it made it to be an all-time favorite. So I gave it 3 stars. I also listened to the audiobook of Divina. This book as well is just stunning. We essentially follow this family. They all get these letters in these really weird, mysterious ways, being delivered by birds, for example. In the letters, they are instructed, these family members, to return home because their grandmother, Qrquidea, is dying. They need to return home to get their inheritance. We're introduced to all these family members and we watch them travel back home. We kind of come to understand that there's a little bit of resentment towards the family and reluctance to return home because of past events and past mysteries. It ends up being a story where there is family mysteries and family curse unfolds, and it's all very magical. I loved it. I really loved this, and I think even more upon finishing it, I love it even more. I loved the writing. I mean, I listened to the audiobook, but it was just a beautifully told story. It was so lush and vivid and magical. There is something about an old woman retelling her story that is so nostalgic and heartwarming, and I think will always make a story special for me personally. It does end up switching between different times, this story. So we have the present time where we have the family members, and then we have the past where we watch Qrquidea Divina grow up and become this magical mystery woman that we know her as and the family knows her as. It's just beautiful. I really want to get myself a physical copy and reread it because I gave it like a 4.25, but I feel like if I read it physically I would love it even more, and I would probably give it 5. So that needs to happen some point in the future. Another disappointment was She Who Became the Sun. I wish I loved this, but I did not. We follow a girl who ends up taking the identity of her brother once he dies. Her brother has been told that he is destined for greatness and, you know, he's going to make his own way in the world and make a huge name for himself. And while she has always been told that she will never amount to nothing, but her brother ends up dying and she ends up taking her brother's name and finds her way to a monastery where she lives as a monk, and she ends up being the one who amounts to this greatness that supposedly her brother was supposed to have. I just never clicked with this main character. I never got invested in their story, and the sapphic relationship in here that I was very excited about, their relationship, I never got invested in. I just don't think things were as developed as I would have liked, and things felt very, not rushed, but skimmed over. I feel like we never went into depth about things how I would have liked to have been. I've talked about this with a couple of friends who were also quite disappointed by this, and they were saying they really didn't like the writing. I didn't really mind it until about halfway through, until it was kind of pointed out to me about how repetitive some of the writing was. Like, there's certain words like greatness, destiny, there were a couple others that are constantly like shoved down your throat to remind you of like what this character's purpose is. I did like, however, the other POV of other characters we followed. Those who were on the opposing political side were so much more interesting, and I was so much more invested in what was happening over there than with our mains, unfortunately. I was expecting to be wowed by this book and I just wasn't. I didn't like the pacing either. Though I have a couple of friends who also were disappointed by this, so many people love this so much and I'm feeling alone over here. I gave it 3 stars. It was a generous 3 stars. We're just gonna leave it at that. Next, let's talk about Ariadne. Ariadne is a Greek retelling. I'm not super familiar with my Greek retelling, so I don't know how much has been changed for the story, but I really enjoyed this. We follow Ariadne and she lives with her sister and her family. They live with their brother, who is a minotaur, and he's kept in the dungeons of their home. The only thing the minotaur eats is people, so there are constant sacrifices, and one day she ends up falling in love with one of the sacrifices and helping him out and setting him free. This is a beautifully told tragic story about how men use women and suppress women, and we just followed Ariadne's journey with this. I really enjoyed my time listening to this audiobook, and I wish I knew more of the origin story. I should really go and read the original story, like I think it's the Minotaur, that's the actual Greek retelling it's based off, and then read this again, because I think there would be so much more I could get out of it. But it's a really good story. I will say something I can remember thinking was, I was reading reviews about how people were saying that they didn't think that this was feminist, and it's sold as a very feminist story, and I think it is. I think just sometimes when we pick up historical books with the expectation that they're going to be feminist, we expect a like feminist modern sort of view, whereas this is historical and it's showing women and their struggles in this time. And I think just because we don't see them rise and fight up or think in a way a modern woman would think, that doesn't mean that it's not a feminist book. I definitely think it's not very fantastical. I read this for my Goodreads vlog, and I say this in the vlog that it's not really fantasy. Like, yes, there's slight fantasy elements, but I would argue that this is more of a literary fiction sort of story than a fantasy story. And my final rating was 3.75 stars. Almost a 4. I also read Practical Magic, which I honestly was not expecting this to be what it was. I was expecting it to be a much more fun time, a much more like witchy, magical, maybe a little bit of a wacky time, but this was so just teenage contemporary girl story. Like, it just was sort of boring. I was expecting to be a lot more entertained. We had witches and the main characters, for goodness sake. There was hardly any magic that went on. It was all about these girls obsessing over boys and being in love with boys and having like boy trouble, and I just was not interested at all. I haven't seen the movie. I know there's a very popular movie with Nicole Kidman. I was really disappointed about this. I just thought there was going to be so much more magic. We essentially follow these 2 girls, these 2 sisters growing up, and they live with their 2 aunts. They are orphans. It's just about their romantic struggles and how either of them can't keep men, basically, and this curse in their family, and why the women in the family don't have men. I gave it 2. Alright, we're down to the last 2 books. My god, I'm getting so stiff. I need to stretch. Like, oh, this is a lot of work. And my voice is getting, well, it's disappearing, honestly. But the next book we need to discuss is The Chosen and the Beautiful. This is a Great Gatsby retelling, and I don't know how to talk about this book. I really struggle to talk about this book in my vlog as well. It is a gorgeously told story. I think Nick Vogue shines with their writing. They are very, very talented. But the story, I I had mixed feelings about. This book we follow Jordan's perspective, and if you haven't read The Great Gatsby or you don't remember the story, Jordan is Daisy's best friend and Daisy is the love interest of Jay Gatsby, the main character. Also, Jordan is the love interest for Nick, who is the narrator of the book Great Gatsby. There were similarities to Jordan's character from the original, but there were also extra additions, like she's queer in here, which was cool to see, and she's also Vietnamese. There's also magic in this book. Like there's ghosts and just things that are very easily put in scenes, like when they're sitting down on couches, the couches are floating. So it's a very light magic that is added, and magic that I would say is more to accompany the setting than to make the characters more powerful or anything of that nature. I think this is a book I need to reread because things were so vague. I don't know how I feel and I don't know exactly really what happened with some things towards the end. A lot of it did follow quite closely to the original story, just from Jordan's perspective. But there were definitely things added, not even like plot points added, but themes and ideas added that were very vague, that I just feel like I didn't fully grasp. But I've seen a lot of people say that. Like it's a very whimsical story that you get lost in, but you also feel lost at times. I just did the worst job explaining that. I really don't know how to talk about that book. So I didn't give it a rating, I just marked it as read on Goodreads because I didn't know how I feel about it. I still don't. The last book we have to talk about is also the book I finished up the year with, and that is The Wolf and the Woodsman, which I really enjoyed. This is not a Little Red Riding Hood retelling. I made the mistake at one point of thinking that, and then I found out it was not. In this we follow a girl who lives in this village, and it's a village with all these women and they all have magical abilities and there's no men around. I can't remember how often, but once a year or so, one of them has to be taken to the king to serve the king in the kingdom part of the world. What ends up happening is our main character has no magical abilities, and it's supposed to be someone who is magical that gets taken. I think it was like the most magical, or maybe someone with a magical type of ability to serve the king. And the person who's supposed to be taken this time is the seer. Our main character ends up getting taken in place of the seer. So she's taken by the woodsman and she goes to the greater city and the kingdom, and she gets all caught up in the politics. There is a really fun dynamic with the woodsman, who is the one who ends up taking her to the king. Maybe even a little bit of a romance. Something I did really like about this was when it comes to the magic in this world, it's magic where to have magic you have to like sacrifice like body parts or sacrifice something, and it was a very interesting cost. I like it when magic has costs and like limitations. I think it makes for a very interesting dynamic and for something to explore. I really like the setting of this. Again, this has got a very cold, wintry setting. I did enjoy the main character as well. I enjoyed both main characters, the boy and the girl. It had really interesting religion themes and power and how those use and abuse power and magic. I loved the writing and the atmosphere. Kind of one of those fairy tale stories, which I think is what made me love it so much, because I am such a sucker for them. I believe that the mythology behind this is Hungarian and Jewish inspired, which I don't think I've read many books that contain either of those mythologies, so I really need to read more because I really liked what I read here. I gave it 3.75 stars in the end. That is it for my thoughts on that book for this video. Oh my god, I feel like I need to go rest. That was a lot of work, but I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts. Let me know if you've read any of these and what you thought of them. I always really love to hear your thoughts on books. It's so fun to hear how someone else can interpret a book the same or completely differently to you. Otherwise, I hope you're enjoying whatever you're currently reading. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!